All right, good morning, guys. I am sorry for the miscommunication yesterday with using Screencastify to get some information out to you all. I got up extremely early. I went through and built a lesson at about 6:30 or quarter to 7. I started a screencast and talked for about 20 minutes and tried to upload it to the Google site, and it sat there for 3 hours, just doing about a millimeter every 10 minutes. And woke up this morning, and that screencast is finally viewable. So later in the afternoon, I had been bombarded with a bunch of emails, so I just went ahead and put the ATV notes up there. I will post the screencast this morning, but you can see by the background, I'm here in the ag office, and my hope is that the Wi-Fi here allows me to get that information out to you better than the internet at my house. So I do apologize. Just as proof, you could see the video is unavailable. It was too long. I tried, that was from YouTube, but it just was not letting me post the video. So anyway, I'm going to try something different. I'm also going to cut my talk time down today, just because if the video is longer, it's probably going to take longer to upload. So I'm going to be brief. A lot of this is just going to be on you. And if you have questions, you can always email me. So today's lesson, I just want you to review for the PPE that you wear when riding an ATV. Then we move into some notes. We're going to talk about ag tires today. So I want you to find a picture that represents those tires. Note the metric classification, which we'll talk about in a second, and then give me a description of what those tires are. This is for you for your notes. I do not need to see this chart. I just want you to be able to map them out. I have seen questions like this before on the end of program assessment, so it'd be good to know. Once you get that done, then just go through and label or answer these 11 questions for me about ag tires. So without further ado, we'll get to it. Okay, so with ag tires, we have this container essentially that holds some volume of air, and that's going to vary based on the type of tire that you have and based on the size of tire. Tires vary greatly in both size and type, and their use. When we check air pressure, if that we're talking the imperial system, equivalent to inches and equivalent to miles, we are using pounds per square inch. So in one little teeny tiny cube of an inch, how many pounds are there? And when you look at your air compressor in your garage, this can be a reading from like 10 up to 150. Sometimes they can get into the thousands depending upon the volume that we're holding. So for example, the welder in the shop, the MIG welder, it has a gas tank on it, which we call a cylinder, and there is 1,000 psi in that tank when it's full. And it can hold like 3,000 psi. So if you think of little square inches, that is the amount of pressure per square inch. And as we use that gas in that cylinder, it lessens. In the metric system, the measurement is bar. So if you're ever using some sort of pressure gauge, be it for tires or for a tank, you might see on the outside it says PSI, and on the inside it says bar. There's a conversion there, just like all imperial to metric systems. When we are looking at tires, we're going to be utilizing the valve stem. That's great. The valve stem in order to take that pressure gauge. And I'm reading my notes here. It's not supposed to be suing, but using a pressure gauge. So on the rim, there's going to be a valve stem. This sticks out. It is a spring-loaded valve that allows for air to go in, and then with the pressure behind it, that plunger is not moving. It's being held in place by the air pressure on the backside of the tire. So if you've ever utilized one of these, you know you can use a tool or your finger to push down on that pressurized stem, and air will discharge from inside the wheel. This particular rim has this C-shaped steel around the valve stem. That's a valve stem protector. A lot of manufacturers are moving to those. That way, if you're using this piece of equipment out on the farm and you drive by a tree limb or some other obstruction, it's not going to knock that valve stem off. Over here, we have a tire pressure gauge. Tire pressure gauge just depresses that needle inside the valve stem, and then it takes an air reading from that jolt of air that comes out. Most of the time, they're pretty accurate. This one here is actually what we'd call a semi tire pressure gauge. It goes up to like 150 pounds per square inch, which is pretty significant. Most of the time, your ag tires are going to be 30 pounds and less, sometimes even 10, as we'll take a look at in a minute. A lot of times ag tires are filled with fluids, and this is done for a few reasons. One, it lowers the center of gravity on that piece of farm equipment. It also balances load. So if that were moving hay or we have a front end loader on that tractor, it's going to keep the back end of the tractor downward. It's also going to provide more traction to that tractor. All of those reasons for weighting those tires is called ballasting, and ballasting just helps balance out that tractor. So you can see here in this picture, they're actually removing the fluid from the tire because they've got to make a repair to it. So it's an involved process, but the majority of tractor tires out there have ballast systems in them, either fluid or the other method that we'll talk about in a second. Lots of fluids can be used as tire ballasting or tire fluid. The most common and the oldest is calcium chloride. Beet pulp juice is being used now as well. It's a brown substance, has a high sugar content. Antifreeze, and then windshield washer fluid, or essentially water that's been treated with ammonia. On this list, if you look it up, you also see water. Here in Kentucky, we don't want to utilize water as a ballast for what's the word I'm looking for? Type, I guess, because it's going to freeze. So if it gets cold, it just turns to ice inside the tire, and it can actually crack that tire, damage it, or cause it to swell. Calcium chloride will not freeze. Beet pulp juice does not freeze. Antifreeze and windshield washer fluid, none of those freeze. So, those are some options. You could use water and then treat it with ammonia. You'd have to make sure that your concentration ratio is correct in order to do so. Downside to putting fluid in rims, especially tubeless rims or tubeless tire setup. So we'll talk about in the next couple of days with installation. Most of the time you have the tire, and then today's manufacturers have developed these rims that can seal that air, that volume of air between the rim and the tire without using a tube. And that technology came about in the late 70s. The problem is when we put fluid in those tires, the majority of these compounds are corrosive. Calcium chloride is very corrosive. Antifreeze is very corrosive. So if it's exposed to the steel constantly, it's going to start to wear away the rim, and in a severe case like this, the whole thing just falls apart. So if there are some implications there. My preferred method of ballasting is to weight the wheels. I'm going to move my... So what you do is you get these round weights that bolt directly onto the rim, and it serves the exact same purpose. So this is a little Kubota tractor that has a front end loader on it, and if you get a load in the front of the loader, you can actually tip the tractor forward. So by having these wheel weights on, it just provides that balance system. It also increases traction, as we talked about. All right, so when we look at ag tires, there's a classification system for these tires. We'll go ahead and get started on those. The most common is called an R1. I'm going to move my camera again. Okay, so R1 are just your standard ag tires. The tread depth is not going to be that deep As you can see, it's a forward V formation. That way, as the tractor tire travels, it moves that mud and that soil outward. Back in the early 90s, Goodyear came out with this tread formation called a long short, which you can see here. We have a long and then a short and then a long and then a short. And the idea was that as the tractor tire rotates, it was going to move any of that mud or that substrate out of the way. They're still manufactured, but they're pretty uncommon. It's difficult to try and find one to match up with. So if you've got a long, short tire pattern on a piece of farm equipment and you go to your dealer, it might be difficult for them to find one to match it up. R2 ag tires are deep lug, which means that lug is significant. Typically, it's going to be over 2 inches from, I went to point at the screen. Good job, Anderson. From this base of the tire to the actual top of the lug. They're going to be at least 2 inches. When we look at an R1, most of the time they're going to max out at about 2 inches. Most of the time, your R2 tires are going to be used for bog work, like in sugarcane paddies, rice paddies, or if it's extremely muddy, your log skidders might utilize these. If you've ever watched the History show Swamp Loggers, they use these as well. Anything to kind of paddle that water and that aggregate that you're driving over out of the way. So it's just a deeper lug tire. I've seen some ag tractors in Kentucky that have had these. I'm guessing they probably got a really good deal on them, or they were in a bind and they need to get a tire fast, and this is what they went with. If that you drive these over a field in the same place, they're going to make a mess. You'll get where you're going, but they are going to rut up your field. So rutting is just the disturbance of the soil layer, and it can have some implications if it's cropland. Number 3, an R3 is called a turf tire. A turf tire looks a lot like a lawnmower tire. These come in varying sizes and shapes. The tread width, so that width of the tire is actually pretty wide compared to your R2s and your R1s. So you can see how the tire is actually, the sidewall here is flush with the rim. So we call this the sidewall, and then we call this the tread width. On most R1 tires, it's going to be pretty flush. When you get to a turf tire, it is a bias tire, which means that it's one piece that curls around here, and then on the tire bead, it seats under the edge of the rim. That bias part bows out and allows to spread the weight out of that piece of equipment. These are commonly going to be used on lawn mowing applications, or if you have a machine that's going to travel back and forth across yards. I've seen some skid steers with turf tires on them for pool installation use. Sometimes, again, farmers get in a bind and they buy turf tires just to put on a tractor so it can keep running. Sometimes people have a R1 set that they'll put on in the wintertime or when they're crop working, and then they put turf tires on it to mow the lawn with a finish mower. Number 4 is an R4, and that's called an industrial lug pattern. So it looks very similar to the R1 in terms of that V formation, except these treads, the lugs, are pretty flat. When we talked about from the base of the tread here to the top of the base of the tread attachment to the top of the tread, we are looking at maybe an inch on these industrial tires. And as they wear, they get pretty flat. The purpose of these is mostly asphalt or concrete or hard surface travel, and then some dirt and aggregate travel, like in the mud. So not going to be ideal for running on a farm, just because those treads are going to fill. There's not much space in there. They're not going to paddle the mud out of the way very well. But if that you are running that machine on concrete and asphalt pretty regularly, they're not going to wear as aggressively as some of those other ag tires would. And it's going to be a smoother ride because those treads are pretty flat. When we look at tires, the width can start to vary pretty significantly, and we do so to spread out that pressure that's being applied to the soil. So it reduces compaction, and in doing so, it enhances traction. This piece of equipment that you see here is a fertilizer spreader. If you get to certain parts of the country, they call it a floater truck. The reason they call it a floater is because the tires that are on there are referred to as flotation tires. They help you float across the soil. We see these types of tires on monster trucks. The reason that they don't just drive into a car and roll the whole body of the car inward is because those tires are so wide, they apply pounds per square inch or pressure evenly across that car. They typically smash it. I saw this. Let me see. Hopefully this works for you. But there was a ad that came out a few years ago by Maytag. They were talking about the strength of their washing machines. So they lined up a set and then they drive over them. And this was actually done. A lot of people tried to see if it was or wasn't. And the washing machines aren't damaged because the flotation, the pounds per square inch going across those washing machines is spread out such that it doesn't matter. One thing you can notice here, a lot of people said it was fake. This was about the time that computer enhancement was becoming a big thing. You can see it's actually rolling the top of those washing machines pretty good, but they are holding up as he drives over them. So it's all tire pressure is what I wanted to point out. If we don't use flotation tires and we run through some soggy soil, we can create ruts. This is a severe case of that, but you can see how those tractor tire lugs are full. And this is an example of a rice paddy tractor where we are spreading out that surface area of the tread path as much as possible. We're still maintaining that lug pattern. They are using an R1, just an ag tire here. They don't have the real deep lugs, but I think they're getting back that extra traction because of the length of that tread. And the same principle is true when we talk about drag cars. Some of you all go to the drag strip for recreation. When we look at drag cars, we see there's extreme width to the rear tires, and that's to increase the surface area. So when rotation is going to those tires, it is it's being absorbed by the tire, and we're actually putting that torque, that traction down to the ground. We're going to talk about front tractor and implement tires tomorrow, and we'll move into tractor sizing. So with that, guys, I'm going to sign off of here. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. Otherwise, just go ahead and take care of these 11 questions for me, share the flashback and those responses, and we'll be good for today. We'll talk again tomorrow.